Welcome back. We are decoding the numbers of the big budget 2021. Prannoy and Dorab are of course with us, but also we welcome on the show Yamini Iyer, President of Center for Policy Research, and Omkar Goswami, Economist, CERG Advisory Limited. Great to have all of you on. Yamini Iyer, let me just start with you, because again, as we were parsing the numbers, much has been made about how implementation could be the issue, but the focus and the kind of vision is quite solid about infrastructure. But even numbers wise, Yamini Iyer, I'm not quite sure, because if you look at it, capital expenditure is only going up by 1 lakh crore. Revenue expenditure is still 3 lakh crore of the total additional spending that the government has planned for the coming financial year. So with a 1 lakh crore increase in capex, can you really claim to have spent in a massive way, turned the economy around?
So sorry, the screen is frozen. So just wanted to say that before I make my remarks. So I'm a bit disconnected from
okay, but we can hear you fine. So go ahead.
You can hear fine. Okay, great. No, so absolutely. I think a couple of things. The overall rise in expenditure for this fiscal is up from about 30.4 lakh crores in the budgeted estimates to 34.5 lakh crores in the revised estimates, is really, frankly, a fairly modest rise, and driven largely by food subsidies and NREGA expenditure, with a very small proportion of increased expenditure for health, which is somewhat surprising against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic, and in fact, the fairly significant increase in activity related to health expenditures consequent to that. On capital expenditures, again, the increase is relatively modest, but let's also remember that the governance challenges facilitating and enabling capital expenditure are significant, and therefore perhaps this is a relatively more realistic expenditure. It's certainly not going to be enough to get us out of the current crisis that we are in. I think that states have been far better at spending on capital expenditure than the center traditionally. There is a commitment to a minor increase in the grants in aid for capital outlays for states. That's a positive sign, but really the rubber will hit the road as far as state governments are concerned. And here I think the somewhat limited devolution to states, despite the very, very welcome commitment to 41% vertical devolution of the 15th Finance Commission, but at least for this year, the devolution to states has been remarkably low, and that's something that's going to affect our spending going forward. Okay.
All right. Also, Shekhar Gupta is with us as well. Prannoy, yes, go ahead, Prannoy.
And Omkar.
Yes.
Omkar and Shekhar, we are looking at, will privatization actually happen? Will implementation actually happen?
Yeah,
last time it was 1/6 of what the projected amount was. And we're looking at numbers. Is it also like the old Socialist Congress? This government doesn't really believe from their heart in privatization, does not really believe in opening up the economy. I mean, that there's one chart which Arvind Subramaniam, former Chief Economic Advisor, and his team gave, and it really has had impact. Just have a look at this. That we are returning to protectionism, are we? 2017 and 2018, just look at the normally about 150 times you increase tariffs, but in 2017, 2018, we increased tariffs 2,460 times. And we're talking about, are we becoming more, 25 years ago, Socialist Congress, protectionism, don't privatize, don't really have too much faith in the private sector. So do we just not look at number? Is there some underlying issue here? Omkar.
Hi, Prannoy, thanks. Can you hear me?
You're very clear.
Okay, thank you. So let me start with your first question on privatization. In the last 3 years, if you take 3 years together, it has been miserable. We have only achieved 45% of the budgeted estimates. And last year, as you said yourself, out of a target of 210,000 crores, we achieved a piddly 15%. That doesn't deter us for asking for another 170,000 crores this year. I am now increasingly of the belief that this government talks about disinvestment, but simply can't do it. You know, there were 42 companies whose names were sent in the previous by the previous Niti Aayog chairman before Rajiv Kumar, Arvind Panagaria, to the Prime Minister, and it went to the to DIPAM, the Department of Private, whatever it is. Okay, they were public investment management, whatever it is. Nothing whatsoever was done. So I'm not at all convinced that this government is into disinvestment and privatization. It doesn't bother them that year on year that they get egg on their face. They may get a big ticket item and they will pass through, but it doesn't bother them. But I think there are some more worrisome things. Let me take you through one. I've got 5. Sorry, you want to go on to Shekhar?
Yes,
or shall I continue?
Yeah, if you just do one for now, because we also have Dr. Amit Mitra, Finance Minister, West Bengal, has just joined us, so, and he's on the clock. But yeah, if you...
No, you can do what you want. You can do what you want.
Okay.
Shall I stop now?
Yeah, no, hang on. Omkar will come back to you for sure. But let's just go across very quickly to Dr. Amit Mitra, because as I said, he's on a tight schedule. Thank you so much, Dr. Amit Mitra, for joining us. What is your take on the budget? The expectation was this is going to be a budget like none we've seen. It is going to give us the sort of required boost to come out of this pandemic hole. Has this budget managed to achieve that?
Of course not. First of all,
I just want to say one thing, Dr. Mitra.
Yes.
You are here as an economist, as an academic, as an intellectual, as a former head of FICCI, not as a politician. No politicians on the panel of FICCI. Yeah. So you are here as a Bengali intellectual.
Okay.
With that caveat, with those caveats.
Yeah. I think, first of all, I think there is a fundamental problem with this government's approach to a long period. 7 quarters of decline in GDP before COVID came, because they didn't know macroeconomics. Now comes COVID. Repeatedly, I wrote to Honorable Union Finance Minister saying, please shift to demand stimulation. And this can be done by putting money into the hands of the people. And this is what all governments in the world are doing. They didn't do it. They are supply side people. You know, it's funny that when you're in a COVID situation, all other countries are doing this. We're putting money into the hands of the people, demand gets created, and then supply responds to the demand. Keynesian versus what is called the Say's law. Probably the Union Finance Minister doesn't know that what she's doing is part of the old classical Say's law, create supply. So first is a fundamental lack of understanding of macroeconomics. I also one day heard Dr. Subramaniam Swamy saying the same thing. And we don't agree on many things, but on this one we do agree. Now let me go to the second point. This is also what I find is a anti-federalist budget. Now, Union Finance Minister herself said it is the states which are in the action mode on the ground for fighting COVID. Now, what happens? What is the outcome? West Bengal spends 4,000 crores on COVID. And how much did it receive from the center? 279 crores. This is a shame. 279 crores out of 4,000 spent. How much do we really need?
I just want to...
We need 11,387 crores. And we have written to the Union Finance Minister precisely.
Right.
But they won't give it.
And the same thing is happening on
now
GST.
You go to the second
I just
issue.
wanted to ask you, just want to interrupt 1 second.
Please.
Because you make an important point and we shouldn't let it pass. The important point is of federalism, of center-state relationships, and we've seen more and more people identifying with their state and, for example, at elections, the turnout in state elections is 10% higher than for Lok Sabha elections. India is a federal state, and federalism requires a communication, compromise, discussion. For example, I think Arvind Subramaniam said this, and I want to just ask you about federalism, that when they introduced GST, it was a great discussion with all parties, all states, and it came in. Okay, it will not be it made too complex in practice, but even with farmers, it's not a federalist reaching out. Is that what you're complaining about, that you want states to be recognized like they should, they deserve to be?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. Dr. Subramaniam knows I was the chairman of the Empowered Committee of Finance Ministers when Mr. Jaitley was there. I pushed for GST on the ground that states would be compensated for 5 years. Now the whole process is going fine. Once Mrs. Sitharaman came as Union Finance Minister, instructed, of course, the Prime Minister's office involved, we went into a complete muddle on GST. We're fighting in the GST Council. It should not happen like that. Let me go to the other part that Dr. Roy, you're asking.
Yes, please.
Devolution.
Yes.
You know, taxes are collected from the states. Center doesn't collect taxes. They are collected from the states where businesses make money. 41% of that is returned to the states, called devolution. Now, do you know that this year, they have not paid West Bengal, and must be similar with other states, 10,000 crores of devolution by December this year. Now, that is all budgeted in my budget for various people-related programs. How do I run it? Let me go to the third question of this question, of what you've asked about federalism. You know, cesses go up every time under this government. Cesses and surcharge. You know what's interesting? Cess and surcharges do not give back to the states the 41%. This is a form of cheating, that you increase cesses and surcharge so that you don't have to share that money with the states. So I can give you ample examples. I sent you a letter of mine written to Honorable Union Finance Minister, one by one showing that there's an anti-federalist process in this government which is alienating us.
Just one question though. One question the finance minister said in her speech, when she was talking about capital expenditure, she said over and above this, we'll also be providing 2 lakh crores to states and autonomous bodies for their capital expenditure. Is that?
This is all to be seen. To be honest with you, I think one of your panelists that I was listening, Dr. Ungar Goswami, said they promise and they don't deliver. Let me give you one simple example on this capital expenditure question. Now, the very key part of infrastructure is roads. Now, West Bengal has produced, according to Government of India confirmed, 88,841 kilometers, over 88,000 kilometers of rural roads. And it has produced 5,111 kilometers of state roads. What do we hear in this budget? We are going to come and give you 625 kilometers of roads. Why? Which states? West Bengal, Assam, and Tamil Nadu. Handpicked. All three are going into election. Now you come and say, I'll give you 625 kilometers, when already the state has done 5,111 kilometers and doing another 1,500 kilometers under construction. Very clearly you can see, Government of India recognizes the performance of West Bengal as #1 in roads, which is a key part of infrastructure or capex. Now what happens? You come and say, I'll give you only 625 kilometers. What is the meaning of this? Therefore, what I am saying to you is, systematically, if the state finances weaken, the nation weakens. And here there's not a word on, for example, unorganized sector, which is in every state. It has collapsed, first due to demonetization, then now with this lockdown, not a word. So where do we provide for them? Every single program. And let me conclude by saying, biggest problem is centrally sponsored schemes given by the Government of India simply have been cut off. and reorganized. So we don't get that money. And the share of states is systematically increased. So it was 60-40, now we have to pay 90% and they'll pay 10%. If you look at that, it is very dangerous, irrespective of who's in power. Indian democracy has to survive on federalist polity, part of our constitution. And I've given you examples after examples where that is not happening.
Thank you.
This budget is another example of that.
Ashok Mitra, thank you. That's very, very clearly
Amit
put.
Mitra,
And
thank
yes,
you.
it is worrying. Thank you. Sorry, Amit.
Thank you so much.
Thanks
Amit
very much
Mitra, who
indeed.
I've only known for 30 years. More.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank
Let-
you.
Let's
As
just
as an intellectual academic.
right.
Thank you. Thank you. And a fighter.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
All Bengalis are fighters.
Okay, let's just go back to Omkar
Let's
Goswami.
go back to Omkar. Yeah.
Yes, sorry, Omkar Goswami, we had to sort of cut you off, but go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to just focus on a few things which disturb me in this budget. But before saying that, let me say the three things that I felt good about. The first is a budget speech, the finance minister's budget speech finished in less than 2 hours, which was like 45 minutes less than it took last time, and she didn't even finish it. The second is that the budget speech, relatively speaking, compared to the last time, was more coherent. The last time was completely incoherent. And the third is, as far as the revised estimate for 2021 is concerned, there hasn't been too much fudging of the fiscal deficit numbers. To say that the fiscal deficit will be 9.5% of the GDP is more or less in line, perhaps even a tad higher than what many of us thought. So I don't think it's too much of fudging on that. Those are the three positives. I have a bunch of concerns. Let me focus on a few. The first is that the amount that the government is expecting as gross tax revenue, gross tax revenue, which then is given out, part of it to the states, and the rest becomes the union government's net tax revenue. What it is expecting as gross tax revenue is over 16% over the last year, whereas GDP growth, as assumed in the budget, is 14.4%. In other words, the amount that you're expecting in gross tax revenue is quite a bit higher in percentage terms compared to GDP growth. And that has not happened, which basically means that something that economists call that the elasticity is greater than 1, and that hasn't happened in India for a long time, and so I don't expect that kind of gross tax revenue collection. So that's number one. Number two is what I talked about, disinvestment. I do not expect 170,000 unless they have some seriously big ticket items. We have failed time and time again, and they would do well to reduce that number by 25% in reality. Number three, and this again is quite important, is that even though we have talked so much about defense, you should look at the outlays on the defense budget, go by line item, and in fact, other than a 9% increase for the army on capital expenditure, there is no increase in the defense budget in the aggregate, both revenue and capital. And number four, and the last point that I want to focus on, is that I cannot understand how for the life of me has the pensions come down by the amount it has. It has actually. Both defense pensions have come down dramatically, and so too has non-defense central government pension bill. How has that happened? It's not been explained anywhere. Last but not the least, I cannot understand how there is a 40% reduction in the fertilizer subsidy. A reduction of that size should have been explained in the budget, and I don't see it anywhere. So there are all sorts of odds and ends that worry me in terms of the numbers.
Okay. All right, interesting
Good
points.
I hadn't noticed some of those.
Yeah, interesting points. We'll unpack all of those very quickly. Also welcoming on the show, we have Dr. Ila Patnaik, professor at the NIPFP, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. And also with us is Dr. Arvind Virmani is with us, of course. Great to have you, Dr. Virmani. He's been former Chief Economic Advisor at the government. Dr. Virmani, how would you respond to some of the points Omkar made, which broadly can be summarized as this kind of gap between the promises and the hype around the budget versus the actual reality of the past record of how all of this is implemented, especially when it has to do with privatization, disinvestment?
Or Virmani, maybe you can make 3 or 4 of your own points also.
Yes, of course. Dr. Virmani. Dr. Virmani, have you muted yourself?
Yeah, so let me start with the broader point where I have disagreements on some of the background which has been put out. So firstly, there is a fundamental change between the Modi 1 and Modi 2. And the first indicator of that was the September 2019 reform of the corporate income tax. Many of us have been arguing for corporate income tax reform for years and years. And I was still surprised to see the 15% for new investment in manufacturing. Why? Why has that been done and why that was good? It was because there is a huge opportunity to attract supply chains which are diversifying out of China, just to give one background. The second point, I think there is no doubt that in Modi 1, protectionism increased. That was the Make in India policy. But the IMF has given a precise estimate. There was the net increase from 2014 to 2019 is 1.3% average increase in tariffs. Okay. And the third point, I do not understand what is the connection between protectionism and privatization. Protectionism has to do with how you treat external trade and external, two-way trade. And privatization has to do with the public sector. They are quite unrelated, and I do not see any connection between the two. The privatization policy, the framework for privatization was approved only a few months ago. This is the first time ever that a proper framework for privatization has been laid out in this budget as a pursuant to what was said 2 months ago. I have been following this for 30 years.
Mr. Virmani, Arvind Virmani, nobody said there's any connection with privatization and protectionism. So that is a straw cutting as some. What's the phrase?
Straw man.
Secondly, privatization. You mean to say for the last 3 years, the government has been having a target of over 2 lakh. One second.
If you didn't say that, then why are you objecting? I don't understand.
No, because there's no point. I'm just going to clarify.
Then let me finish what my points are.
I'm just asking you on privatization. Last year, over 2 lakh crores was targeted without any proper plan. Without a plan.
I heard that from Omkar. Okay? Let me finish my point.
Okay, calm down.
Sitting quietly for 20 minutes. Okay? Listening to politics.
So,
Okay. Go ahead, Mr. Go ahead, Dr. Virmani.
There's no point calling me if you don't let me speak.
No, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, so privatization framework. Anybody who says this is something which is nothing, this will require a change in the Nationalization Act, which was implemented in 1970. It's 50 years. So anybody who says this is a non-policy, I don't understand what they are saying. There must be something, that I'm getting old and I don't understand. This is a major change in policy. It is what we used to call big bang reforms. I was involved in the 97 tax reforms. I put up a file which led to that reform, and we called it big bang reform. So this is big bang reform, the privatization policy. Now, about actual implementation, that is absolutely correct. I am not disputing that the number which is 1.7 is less than 2. but there's never been such an explicit commitment. And I'd much rather have a policy, and it is a change. Anybody who says that this is not a fundamental change in policy, I cannot agree with. Okay. Now, and finally, on some of the other issues, the GDP and revenue. Yes. Now, there's something called an automatic stabilizer. I dealt with the global financial crisis in 2009. I was CA. Okay. When you have a sharp fall, when you close down 40% of the economy, revenues shut down. When you lift that lockdown, they will go up. So this is not, it's wrong. You know, we have 7 papers in 7 months of last year. This is not something surprising. I've been saying it repeatedly for the last 9 months that this is a completely unusual situation. And anybody who insists on analyzing it like as if it is just normal fluctuations up and down is wrong.
Okay.
This has nothing to do with normal buoyancy.
Right.
It is a peculiar situation of the pandemic.
Okay. Fair enough. Let's also just go across to Neelkant Mishra with Credit Suisse and also member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Sorry to keep you waiting, Neelkant. Neelkant, if you'd like to, I mean, of course, feel free to share your thoughts on the budget, but also respond to what Dr. Amit Mitra was saying, that the fundamental flaw in his view with the budget was that the idea was to stimulate demand. That meant putting money in people's hands instead of these, complex loans and other fiscal measures. That was the crucial missing link in the budget.
Yeah, like Dr. Virmani, I mean, I kind of disagree with a lot of what was said. So, and not because, I'm advising or not advising the government. I think just factually incorrect statements have been made before me. So on the specific question you asked, the expenditure to GDP ratio in FY21 and FY22 are the highest since 1988, right? So anyone saying that there is no demand stimulation needs to go and check their facts, right? So the expenditure to GDP ratio, which had been falling steadily, the government, very rightly so in many ways, was shrinking its presence in its footprint in the economy and letting the private sector do its bit. This year and next year, FY21 and 22, the expenditure to GDP ratio is the highest since 1988. Even from a federal perspective, I agree that the tax growth has to a large extent been on the non-shareable pool, but at the same time, the state governments have been allowed to have a higher fiscal deficit for another 2 years. And if you see the numbers, we talk on just budgeted numbers, and I think the budgeted numbers are actually quite conservative. And I would say that if I was the government, I would have budgeted for higher tax revenues. But there are 3.3 lakh crores of surplus cash. As you know, the government's banker is the RBI. There is 3.3 lakh crores, 1.6% of GDP of cash, surplus cash, lying with the RBI. And if you do your fact finding, you realize that a large part of that is with the state government. The state governments can't park that cash that way. So what they do, without making it sound too technical, they buy Government of India T-bills. The T-bills issuance right now is very high level. I think the state governments are struggling to spend. As the tax revenues go up, a lot of the discussion on the fiscal, on growth, etc., is very backward looking. In fact, I would say that even the government this year, in fact, the best way to measure the accuracy, or rather the measure of the forecast accuracy, would be FY22 over FY20. Because FY21 was you can call it a gap year, right? Because there were one-off expenditures, food subsidy went to 4.2 trillion rupees, free grains were distributed. Fertilizer subsidy, to answer Dr. Goswami's question, there was 48, so this was announced in the last Atmanirbhar package. 48,000 crores of fertilizer subsidy arrears were cleared, right? Which is why this year the fertilizer subsidy number is 1.33 trillion. And next year it goes back to the 79,000, 80,000 crore range. Because the subsidies that were arrears have been cleared this year, which is why that number drops next year. Now, those things have been a distortion in aggregate expenditure. So if you compare FY22 to FY20, the tax number growth is like 5% CAGR, 5% annualized, which is, I think, a very low number. In fact, the government's projection for nominal GDP this year is actually lower than the IMF's projection, right? And I think that those numbers in the IMF's numbers need to be revised up by at least 3%.
Right. These are good points, actually. Thank you for making these points. They're very clear, and it's important to hear them. Yeah. And we'll just come back to you. I just want to bring in Shekhar Gupta here. Shekhar, I want you, you're a man of numbers, I know, and you really have them on your fingertips, but just for a moment, the bigger picture. Is this government a bit like the old Congress government, which doesn't really believe in privatization, believes in protectionism, even though the two are not related? But is there a philosophy, is there an ideology which is not really pushing the free market?
Look, first of all, on a day when the government says that it's going to sell this many companies and also 2 PSU banks and IDBI and a general insurance company and list LIC, on a day like that, I cannot say that this government is against privatization. Maybe when we review this a year from now, or maybe even 6 months from now, we could say, okay, they did not keep their promise, they flattered to deceive. That is a possibility. But the promise is made today, and I think you pointed this out in your morning discussion. You'll be surprised to know that I watch your discussions, even when I'm not there, particularly when I'm not there. You said that it's the first time that a government has used the term privatization. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about this. When Vajpayee started it, he called it disinvestment. Right? Arun Shourie was disinvestment minister. Before Vajpayee, Pakistan had started this process under Nawaz Sharif in his first government. He set up a national privatization commission. And he would always ask me, why is your government not saying privatization ministry? Why is your government saying disinvestment ministry? Then when Narendra Modi's government came, it became DIPAM, which was even more of a euphemism, which meant nothing. Now, no government reforms like Thatcher or Reagan these days because they fundamentally believe in that stuff. They do it because they have to. So this government now, right now, is under pressure. They had 7 successive quarters of economic decline, growth decline, and now they've had negative growth for 4 quarters. So they are really in, this is a first-class crisis. So in this one, if the government says that they are going to sell, BPCL has been on the line for some time. Frankly, even if BPCL alone sells, almost half of this money will be recovered. So I would not take a negative view on this just like that. Having said that, this government is protectionist. You see in today's tariff changes also, tariff increases, the government is protectionist, but protectionism is not about the public sector, protectionism is for the private sector. So in fact, you can turn around and say crony capitalism, because this government is raising tariffs to protect the private sector, not public sector. Public sector is hardly competitive in those areas. So that they are doing, I would say that this government's ideology, yes, it is not a free market ideology, but it's more closer to state capitalism.
Something we've been saying for the last maybe 3 decades, socialism for the rich, capitalism for the poor.
Well, I don't think that's quite correct in this case, but we may still be saying it 1 year from now.
Okay.
Right.
Also bringing in Dr. Ila Patnaik. Dr. Patnaik, your thoughts on the budget, and what is the story of this budget really that you are picking up?
I think that the most important and the key message that comes out of the budget is from what is not there. So what wasn't there was populist schemes, a large number of small schemes, each catering to one sector or the other. There was no announcement for building a statue or anything with ideological or political salience. It was more about, okay, we want growth, capital investment, infrastructure spending, infrastructure investment. And that was part of the reason. The fact that all these things were not there was part of the reason, I think, that the message that comes out of the budget is that it is pro-market and pro-growth. Even if, I've been listening to all these questions about implementation questions about whether things will actually get done on time or not, or whether the numbers are right or not. But I think we should focus on the fact that this time the key message was different from the key message that came out of budgets in maybe the last 15 years or so. So that plus, some of the things that Shekhar has been talking about privatization, saying that we are going to privatize 2 public sector banks, using the words privatization, as Prannoy discussed this morning, is, something we haven't heard for a very long time. And I think it was also critical that she said that other than in the 4 strategic sectors, in all other sectors, public sector enterprises will be privatized. So the message you get is that it is in favor of privatization. You also get the message that this is not a government that is going to do populist things at this time, when it would have been very easy to do populist things. COVID time, job losses, so many sectors hurting. It would be very easy to say that, our deficit is going to be 9.5 again. Budget estimates are going to be another 9.5% of GDP, and that we are now going to do demand boosting, which means transferring money into people's accounts, to either Jan Dhan accounts or to companies. It also did not do any of the anti-rich tax increases that we've seen in the last few years, and which I think a lot of people were scared of, that there could be a COVID cess, there could be a tax on the rich, further taxes, just redistribution as against growth. So at least for me, that message was what came out of the budget. Of course, there is protectionism, as as Shekhar was just discussing, but I think she also tried to not do the anti-globalization message. And the big thing, that the government has been stuck on for a very long time, this FDI cap in insurance had almost become like something that is a test of the government, whether it's reformist, open to the world or not. And that was a signal where it was raised from 49 to 74, also to perhaps balance out the effect of the increasing protectionism one saw in Atmanirbhar Bharat and with the increase in custom duties that one is seeing. So, really, my takeaway was that's why the markets responded positively, and giving this message of pro-market, pro-growth, not public sector enterprises. The recapitalization amount to banks has been limited to 20,000 crores. So let's see what happens during the year. But even beyond the implementation, I think the messaging was very, very important.
Right. Very interesting. In fact, it's interesting that you mentioned that point about the insurance, because normally that would have reacted, they would have seen some kind of reaction in Parliament that you're going from 49 to over 70%. But it just passed quietly. Barely anyone took note of it, though it was a big step. We also have Prannoy Pramod Bhasin, Chairman CLIX Capital and founder of Genpact, which is the business process outsourcing BPO firm. So good to have you, Pramod Bhasin. Just to ask you, Pramod Bhasin, on the point about jobs, though, because as much as the budget was meant to be about raising demand, the other question was to address jobs. We've seen huge job losses during the pandemic. Did the budget do anything to address that? Firstly, from your point of view, is it still quite bad in terms of unemployment, and did the budget really do enough to create jobs or to stimulate employment?
I think that's the important question for me, is what did it do for jobs? And not in the medium term, but in the short term. So, the budget has been very good, I think, and it's quite surprising. I totally agree with what Ela was saying. It's quite surprising their stance on public investment, disinvestment, or privatization, whatever you wish to call it, their stance in terms of insurance. They've opened up a lot of things that you would have thought this government may not want to do. But on the jobs front, and particularly in terms of supporting MSMEs, there is no direct way in which they have shown that they will go out and help these people. You know, the retail sector, the restaurant sector, hospitality sector is on its knees. Construction is still on its knees. And in those areas where you would have the opportunity to help them directly and create more jobs, I haven't seen anything. Having said that, I think it's actually very difficult for the government to find ways to directly help these small businesses in the short term. We have no mechanism. You know, there's no point the RBI giving money to the banks because the banks don't lend to them. They can give it to the NBFCs in turn. Some of them are lent to these smaller companies. So the broad question that we unfortunately are left with is, how do we get these small businesses back up and running very quickly, because jobs are desperate? The last point I'll just make, though, which gives me hope, is I think India is going to have an astonishingly high trajectory of growth. We're going to, coming out of COVID, I think you're going to see an amazing amount of expenditure, consumption. You know, I was at the airport this morning going to Chandigarh. It took me half an hour to get through security queues because the lines were so long. It's as if COVID doesn't exist. So people are going to get back into business. They are going to spend money. And I'm really hoping that all of that will trigger growth, which in turn will allow all these migrant workers who have gone away to come back. Construction. I wish a lot more could have been done in construction, not just in affordable housing, but in broad construction, because those are the people that employ millions of these jobs and provide that kind of sustenance. But I didn't see some of that. So the jobs question, sorry for this very long answer, is left unanswered in many ways.
Very, very balanced and very, very interesting. Let me just ask now, Yamini Iyer, again, a couple of data points that Arvind Subramaniam has written about in his paper, and it's about the new form of hardware welfareism, where free LPG gas cylinders, and you know, it really has been a huge success. And if you look at the data on that, we can just show the graphic, that along with other forms like, here we are, new welfareism, you can see that there's been an increase in, you know, toilets, LPG, housing, as well as electricity. So, you know, these things, and including, you know, women using bank accounts. That's on the one side, and this has really been successful. But on the other side, and I think this has been perhaps fortunate, it wasn't really in focus earlier, but if we move on to the next graphic, about how has all this changed people's lives and, say, children. And it's extremely worrying. Healthcare, child healthcare has had a terrible blow. And if you look at each of the graphic, it was going down, the trend that child stunting was going down, anemia was going down, everything was going down. Acute respiratory illness was going down. They're all either going up or that trend of going down is over. This is what matters to people on the ground, that, you know, India should be way better at all these numbers. So Yamini, I think the point is healthcare and putting money in people's hands could change all this.
Absolutely.
Or you don't agree?
Absolutely. Ultimately, the objective of increased welfare spending should always be measured by its outcome, not by its output. And that's at the heart of what makes for good expenditure management. New welfareism, as I've written about in a paper with Nilanjan Sirkar, has been very, very politically effective. It has gained political dividends because it ensures attribution to the political power at the center. But there are questions about how effective this is at its ability to deliver on outcomes. And here I think this is very important about this budget. There is from March 25th onwards, the migrant crisis that became emblematic of India's COVID response and the impact of the lockdown was a very deep reminder of two really important things. Number one, as the World Bank has told us, despite a significant increase in lifting out of poverty consequent to the good growth years, 50% of India still remains what they define as vulnerable, i.e. a single income shock can push you back into poverty, which is why India needs to have strong social protection that actually is growth enabling and will enable the bulk of India's population to move from being vulnerable into relatively better off. And the fact that this was only mentioned in passing in the budget speech, the One Nation, One Ration card was discussed, but no real debate, discussion, or budget allocations for improved social protection, increased social protection is a real scar, I think, on this budget. Second related point, Neelkant rightly mentioned that expenditure as a percentage of GDP is in fact amongst highest since 1988. But it's also important to remember that GDP contracted quite significantly, and the expenditure demands on the budget for this year were very, very different to expenditure demands for budgets in any other year. So we need to look at FY21 within the specific context of what FY21 required. What we do see here is the increase in expenditure is largely on account of food subsidy and Manrega, which is as well as fertilizer subsidy. So that was part of the sort of relief component of the Atmanirbhar package. And an interesting only 4% increase in the expenditures from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. We see this continuing. There is a very important announcement in the budget this year of the launch of a new program, the Prime Minister's Swasthya Atmanirbhar Swasth Bima. Sorry, I forget the acronym. There's no clear allocation for it, but what's really important there is that it lays out a sort of a budget allocation over 6 years, relatively low than is needed, but nonetheless, and some of the direction in which it is headed, focus on primary healthcare, focus on public health in particular, district laboratories, etc., are certainly steps in the right direction. But without increased allocations in health, we are not going to solve the problem that you have mentioned. And it is important to also recognize, just a last point on the issue of federalism, the impact of COVID on state budgets is really significant. What the central government has done is to increase the borrowing limit, but essentially leave the states to borrow from the market, while at the same time tax devolution to states has dropped. I think that the commitment to a 40% vertical devolution that the budget has made as per the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission is important. But if we look at what happened in the 14th Finance Commission period, the central government never lived up to that full commitment because it imposed cesses and surcharges.
Right.
It's very important to ensure that the commitment to fiscal devolution is actually met in the period of the 15th Finance Commission, and we should watch that closely.
Fair points. As we start to wind down, Shekhar Gupta, just to move away and just step back a bit and try to look at the story of this budget, because this government, all governments, but this government particularly, is very, very obsessed with the headlines. What is the big headline or headlines, do you think, that this budget has generated? The chief economic advisor said tomorrow, this is the day before he's presenting the economic survey, on budget day, you will get both Pant and Pujara. Have we got more Pant or more Pujara?
Well, I think I'll leave cricket aside for a moment. I'll bring in Gordon Gekko. Remember Michael Douglas from Wall Street?
Yes.
And I will just tweak Gordon Gekko's line. In fact, in an article I've written, I've taken the whole quote, but I will not inflict the whole quote on you. But this is a budget. If you ask me, my headline, Modi government is now saying growth is good, because they are putting all their eggs in the growth basket. Because if growth doesn't take place, their revenues will not come in, then nothing will work. They will completely fail. So this is a big punt, as in P-U-N-T, not punt as in Rishabh. This is a big punt on growth. And I think it is also, politically, it is Narendra Modi's first BJP budget, because his 6 budgets so far were Congress budgets. Congress plus, Congress plus plus, Congress plus plus plus, and so on. This is the first BJP budget. This is a hard turn to the right.
Okay.
Very good.
Interesting. Just quick comments on that from everybody. Neelkant? Yes.
Yeah, so the government, I think, is very cognizant of the fact that it has limited capability, right? So, running an organization with, even if you exclude railways and post and all that, there are 300, 400,000 people. Getting them to do the right thing, and especially if you have to spend on things which you don't directly control, it becomes very challenging. So I think the government has been very careful on what it can spend without leakage and where it can actually control the outcomes, and recognizing that it has limitations in how much it can spend prudently. So I agree with the fact that perhaps more money could have been spent, but then spending it knowing what the outcomes can be and without leakage is actually much harder than it seems, which is why I think the government has laid out a fiscal roadmap for 5 years, where it gets enough fiscal space. Now, interestingly, it realizes that if it can't spend, it should trigger animal instincts of the wealthy and the industrialists in terms of boosting aggregate demand. And I think many of the decisions, I think Ila rightly said, it is equally important what the government did not do. And I think by not doing those things, they have created a very positive vibe as the economy rebounds very sharply from the pandemic. And I think the spending by companies and individuals and households is likely to give a bigger boost than if the government had actually taxed them more and tried to squeeze in through pipes which don't exist.
Okay.
Right. I really was taken up by what Pramod Bhasin said about how, and I totally agree that people are going to now, go a little wild, spend, travel, and you can expect quite a good bounce back. But still, Pramod Bhasin, there is this question of the poorest. And, you mentioned even the migrants who need to get back, and just generally the poorest in our society. Is there room, like what other societies, other developing countries are, of actually a greater welfare state where the government actually puts cash in the hands of the poorest to help them through this tough time?
Prannoy, I really feel they should have done that. I know many more distinguished economists would feel that that may be bad for the fiscal deficit, etc. But there's no way to help these people except to get cash to them. It's going to take too long to trickle through the banking channels, through the lending channels. MSMEs are flat on their back. Retail, restaurant, lots of places could have done with a tax break just directed at them to say, here it is, or directed in a way which says, if you employ X number of people more, we'll give you Y amount of money, which you can spend on payroll, or provide a helping hand with payroll as Germany and many other countries did. So I felt that that was missing, although this was a terrific growth-oriented budget. I agree with Shekhar, it's a big punt, but I'm not sure how big a punt it is, because honestly, India is going to be on a massive growth trajectory, and so is the world, by the way, although our growth rates will probably be higher than anyone. It'll be somewhat fake because, frankly, our growth rates were down so far. It'll look exuberant when it probably, on balance, we will not even get back to where we were 2 years ago. But it's still going to make people feel very good, and I think that's a very important element of what the future will look like. Okay. I'm certainly seeing it in our industry and banking and other places. You're going to see people willing to go out, borrow. We're already seeing business pretty much back to 80 to 90%. And that's the most surprising fact that I've been looking at over the last few months.
Right.
Last one. I wish they had done more on ease of doing business, because that's still a bad news story.
Yes. Okay.
Onkar, some last words from you. We are running out of time. Quickly we'll run through everybody. Last words from you, Onkar.
Okay. Thank you, Prannoy. A very simple point. This budget is way better than the previous budget, and that is saying actually quite a lot. No, the previous budget was very bad. This budget is actually pretty growth-oriented, and by most accounts, people will have not that much negative to say. Perhaps more things could be done, but it has done quite a lot, and so kudos for that. My second point, and my more important point, is yes, there will be slippages. I do not believe that they will get the amount of tax revenue that they are expecting. You may not even get the disinvestment unless you get some real big ticket items. You may fall short on a few other items. And at the end, next year, your fiscal deficit, instead of being 6.8% of GDP, may go up to 7.6, 7.7, maybe even 7.8% of GDP. But you know what? When you come out of a drop of 23%, then 7.5%, come out in the year and expect to go at 11% nominal and 14.5%, 11% real growth and 14.5% nominal growth, even if you slip the fiscal deficit by 1% of GDP, who cares? The only people who you think care are the rating agencies, and my answer to them is buggered. Screw them. Forget it. Hell with them.
Okay.
On the replay, we will beep that.
Ila Patnaik, if you were an editor and wearing your imaginary editor hat, what would be your headline from the budget?
That the government seems to be betting on crowding in for job growth. So normally, we've become so used to governments depending on Manrega, on saying I will do so much skill development and create so many jobs, that we've forgotten that the way to jobs in a market economy is to have more investment. And if the public sector, government, along with private funding, and manages to get investment in infrastructure. So if it is jobs for construction jobs, then it is getting jobs directly in the construction sector. But otherwise, if it is building infrastructure, then that crowds in private investment, and that is the way forward in jobs. And I think we've forgotten that for so many years, that today when we see that approach, and that's what seems to be the approach and the bet and the punt in this budget, that's what will take off, because the biggest problem, as you said, is today jobs. But for that, I think a completely radically different approach has been taken compared to what we've seen in the last 4, 5, 6, maybe about 15 years.
Right.
Not after the Vajpayee years and the privatization and growth pattern, growth framework of those years, have we seen this happen?
Okay.
So I think my headline would be betting on crowding in.
Crowding in. Interesting. Anyway, we're completely out of time, but thank you all so much for joining us. It's been a fantastic panel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll have to leave it there.
Thank you all. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night.